All right, so you're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez, and with me today is fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau. Pete, how's it going today?
Fantastic, Bernie. Very excited for our topic and our guest today, and can't wait to dive right in. My sandals are on. I've got my scabbard, and I'm ready to roll.
There we go. Speaking of our amazing guest today, so that is Nick Diak. So Nick is a writer, pop culture scholar, conference convention speaker, and fellow podcaster. Nick, welcome to Fan2Fan. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, I appreciate the invite and thanks for having me. It's good to see y'all.
So if you have not heard of Nick, his areas of interest and expertise include Peplum, and like Pete was alluding to, sword and sandal media. And that's really kind of the focus of what this episode is about. We're going to focus on Peplum, a term that I found Googling, and all of a sudden you start realizing that when you talk about movies like Gladiator or 80s movies like Beastmaster, they kind of live in this genre, in this world that's actually known as Peplum. Nick is an expert in the genre of Peplum. So we're going to talk about that. He also enjoys Italian Euro cinema, exploitation cinema, horror, H.P. Lovecraft studies, of which he actually has a podcast with his fellow podcasting partner, Michelle Brittany, the H.P. Lovecast podcast dedicated to the works inspired by Lovecraft. And he also likes tiki's and cocktails.
I think you nailed pretty much everything. You make me sound way cooler than I feel like I am.
There's a diverse, you've got a very diverse background, Nick, and I feel like we could ask you about any and all of that. We're going to try and narrow the focus for today, though, if we can.
Right.
You have many things in the parentheses behind your name, Nick, and we're going to take advantage of that. So you have a pretty good bibliography. You've worked on everything from horror literature, from Gothic to postmodern critical essays, Lost Nights and Dangerous Days, unraveling the relationship between Stranger Things and Synthwave, a favorite of Pete's, uncovering Stranger Things essays on 80s nostalgia, cynicism, and innocence in the series. And what caught my attention, Nick, and this is where I found your name online, was your collection of essays on, it's called The New Peplum, essays on sword and sandal films and television programs since the 1990s. So again, if you're checking this out, we're going to be talking a lot about some really fun movies, TV shows, even some cartoons. Nick, take it away. Give us kind of like the introduction. So what is Peplum?
It depends on what your framework is, if you want to be snarky about it or appreciative of it. But Peplum was a term that came out around in the 60s by French critics to describe a cycle of Italian low-budget films that kind of centered on Grecian and Roman of antiquity, although it would sometimes go out to like barbarians and Egyptian type stuff. And it was called Peplum because, well, the characters in it wore, peplums. They wore togas. And the other kind of synonymous term was sword and sandal because, well, the genre describes what the folks are wearing. It's a very object-oriented genre. So they got a sword, they've got a sandal. And it sounds kind of silly, but it's one of the few genres out there that it's a noun, it's a tangible thing. Like, horror is a feeling, an action adventure film is a feeling, a noir is a feeling. The sword and sandal they're objects, they're tangible. The only thing kind of close to that would be like Westerns, which is a setting. But anyway, they came about in the 60s in response to, depending on who you will talk to, either the first Hercules film was the genesis of it or Ben-Hur. And I'm of the camp that Ben-Hur kind of started it because Italians are really good at taking something and running with it and giving it their own spin. And so I'll probably be one of the only people out there that actually calls Ben-Hur a sword and sandal film. But yeah, what happened was in the late 50s, a lot of English and American productions were going over to Europe, especially to Italy. And that's when they took advantage of a lot of cheap sets, a lot of extras. And Rome had just built this ginormous studio. And I think it was called Cincinita. Don't quote me on that one, but let's go with it. It was huge. And, they shot Ben-Hur there. And afterwards, they're like, wait a second, we got all the stuff left over. We could do what they do and do it cheaper. And that's kind of how Hercules came about. Hercules rode on the kind of the same stuff that production wise that Ben-Hur had. And then Hercules was a huge success, and people realized, wait a second, we can crank out genre cinema, because before this, at times they were doing neo-realism, rose realism cinema, movies like Bitter Rice, melodramas. They didn't really had a genre cinema before Hercules, and Hercules just opened up the floodgates for this basically low budget filmmaking. When I say low budget, I don't mean it like in a derogatory sense. They were able to realize big scale things. When you think of like historic epics like Cleopatra or Ben-Hur, you see this big scale, and then all of a sudden it became accessible, especially to smaller filmmakers. And so that's kind of when Hercules came out, you had this big Technicolor film, big widescreen. I always, try to imagine myself being in the audience, seeing Hercules the first time. You got Steve Reeves up there, chains in each hand, pulling down the pillars. I mean, that's IMAX, like in the late 50s. And it just kind of spawned that. What happened is it started the sword and sandal cycle. A lot of other production crews got into that, like, well, we could do our own Hercules films. And since it's in Italy, there's a rich history of, ancient Rome. Next door is, Greece, all that stuff. So they had subject matter galore. They had film crews galore. They had the sets all there. And when it was done, because the whole cycle lasted a couple years, they still had, genre directors, genre production crew, Americans that came over. Well, what else can we do? And so it created this cycle of, okay, well, let's do spaghetti westerns, let's do Euro spy films, let's do giallos. And usually they're all responding to, some other country made a big film. Well, we're all aligned to do it. Let's make our version. So that's kind of the super condensed version of Peplum and sword and sandal films of the very late 50s and 60s.
And I was going to say that makes sense, because when I think of movies like this, and, I think of like the big budget, you were talking about budgets, the big budget Hollywood films like 10 Commandments, you mentioned like Ben-Hur, Samson and Delilah. But it's funny you mentioned spaghetti westerns, because in researching some of this and just get a better sense for, for this genre, the spaghetti western bridge, that connection made more sense to me, because I'm a big fan of Sergio Leone. So when Fistful of Dollars comes out in like 64, that seems to be the thing that sparks the Django series and Death Rides a Horse, Duck You Sucker, The Great Silence, Sabata, all of those movies that were in response to the beginning of the Dollars trilogy.
Yep.
So in a way, is that kind of what Ben-Hur was to all of these other films into like the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even now into more of like a modern day reinterpretation of that Peplum genre?
I say Ben-Hur just because it was the first big budget. I mean, it was made on Italian grounds and production stuff, but it was really Hercules that came immediately after it that realized we don't need the Ben-Hur budget to do it. So again, that's where, I'm flippy floppy. Most people accept that it's Hercules that did it, so we'll go with that. But Hercules is the one that kind of spawned that. But yeah, the folks that made those films, like Sergio Leone, he was a Peplum director. He did Colossus of Rhodes. A lot of the horror directors, they all got their start in the Peplum genre. Mario Bava, Riccardo Freda, Antonio Margheriti. The only one who didn't was Dario Argento. He came a little bit later writing for Westerns. But yeah, usually it's like one trigger film that will spawn the remakes, the cash grabs, the sequels. So yeah, Hercules for Peplum, the Dollars trilogy for spaghetti westerns. For giallos, it would be called The Evil Eye, but has a different name that's known by, I think, The Girl Who Knew Too Much with John Saxon. Barbarella and Danger Diabolique helped spawn a small wave of comic book Italian films. Black Sunday helps on the Gothic horror film. So, all it took was this one successful film. They have the dominoes lined up to do all that.
And that's such an interesting point and perspective of how, finding that one thing to then kind of build like an industry off of. And we'll probably get into this a little bit later, but it's making me think of Roger Corman, who was heavily involved in the 80s, because he basically did the same thing. There's no blockbuster movie that came out in the 70s and 80s that he wouldn't then, let's make 10 Star Wars type movies. Let's make 10 Conan the Barbarian type movies.
And you know what? The Italians, they kind of continued the practice up into the 80s. They still did that, albeit on a smaller scale. In the 60s, Italy was going through like a big economic boom. It was flush with cash. And it was also going very culturally, going through a cultural boom as well. They were exporting more films, both the A-list stuff and, you know, the genre stuff. But the thing is over the decades, when you got into the 70s and into the early 80s, Italy was a little later to adapt television, because back in the day, towns, if you ever seen the movie Cinema Paradiso, it kind of sums it all up. You didn't have a Netflix back then, but what you did have is you had a town and you'd have the one theater, and that was your Netflix. You would have a steady stream of content going through it. And what was that steady content? It was genre cinema, because you can't run a theater just on Fellini films and they're auteur directors. They're not prolific, but the genre cinema could do it. We could crank out 10 Peplum films and 3 Eurospy films in 3 months, and you're good to go. But I shouldn't say unfortunately. This is how it changed. Television came in and it kind of killed the idea for a theater, but it brought in the VHS era, and the Italians were kind of good to pivot to it, and they still carry that practice of, here's the one film, let's cannibalize it. And unfortunately, it didn't make these big cycles. Peplum films, there's hundreds of Peplum films. There's hundreds of spaghetti westerns. But the cycles kind of got smaller and smaller. So when you got to the 80s, you still had like 80s Peplum. Conan the Barbarian came out, and that would be considered sword and sorcery, but for all purposes, it's still a Peplum film. It's still, you have a strong man with a sword, with fuzzy boot sandals, but hey, that's successful. How can we cannibalize this? So the Italians made their own sword and sorcery films, like the Barbarians being one. Dawn of the Dead came out. Well, that's super successful. Can we do it? Yes, we can. Lucille Fulci will go in there and make zombie and all these zombie knockoffs. Even movies that don't really have zombies in it, but like Zombie Birds would still become a zombie sequel. Mad Max comes out. Well, we could do apocalyptic films. So it didn't become cycles of hundreds. It became cycles of dozens, but it was still a practice there. And to me, that's just kind of interesting that you can view them as knockoff films or cash grab films, but there's this distinct Italianness to them that makes them a bit more, I want to say, sincere than a lot of other, like the cash grab films that you would see like in the 90s and 2000s, and even today, like, a Bruce Willis cash grab. I just watched an episode of Red Letter Media where they talked about, here's like 30 Bruce Willis films that came out direct to video in the last 2 years. There's no heart to that. There's no sincerity to that. But these older films, there is especially Italian films, yeah, they're knocking things off, but they bring a charm to it. They do bring a craftsmanship and a uniqueness to it, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Because I think there's that interesting division between the two, because there's that, and you mentioned this in the book, the idea of like the high culture and the low culture.
Yeah.
So when I think of like the high culture, again, going back to a touch point for me in spaghetti films, I think of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, or another Sergio Leone movie, Once Upon a Time in the West, versus say something that maybe you could argue is more, low culture, like They Call Me Trinity, right? Where I'm thinking like something like 10 Commandments, Spartacus the Robe, is it Quo Vadis? Like those are like those high culture, big budget Hollywood movies versus, like Beastmaster, or even something like you mentioned, Conan the Barbarian, the Deathstalker series, the Conan films, the Barbarians, featuring the Barbarian brothers.
Yep.
Where those feel like those, byproducts of the proliferation of VHS and having the stock video store shelves. And, if someone had to do it, and Canon Films and Roger Corman and, Italian studios were more than happy to do it.
Mm-hmm. And the Italians, they were the most aligned. I think only like in the 60s, outside of the US, they were the number one at exporting cinema. Now, again, that would change over time as television came more involved, and the Japanese market actually became a lot more exporting, especially, post Godzilla, because Japan would later have their own economic boom and like, hey, we can crank out movies too. But yeah, I think that's kind of the sad, I don't want to say the sad thing, it's just a sad perspective that a lot of these films, especially Peplum films, they're looked at, as knockoffs, as cheap cash grabs. And it's kind of sad because they're treated that way as well. A lot of these films don't survive to today. They only survive in like really bad English edits and bad color tinting and whatnot. And it still takes forever for folks to appreciate that, a film. Okay, let me back this up. My hat is off to anyone who can make any type of film. Even if it's a really bad film, a low budget film, filmmaking to me is the ultimate art form. Everything else, they're still art forms, but they're all solo activities. You can write, you can paint, you could do music. I mean, you could play every instrument and then garage band it all together. But filmmaking and stage acting are like the two, you can't do it by itself. It's a communal thing. You have to have other people. Now, side note, I know folks might argue, well, you can animate a movie by yourself or CGI an entire movie by yourself. I'm not going to talk about that. But just the fact that a film even exists, that you are able to project manage, direct, write, score, whatever, to get this out there, to me is an impressive feat, no matter what quality. And it always saddens me that, after a film has come out, that folks do view it as a small shelf life. The silent film era, they'd crank out a film and they would just toss it. They would even make it on terrible film quality that would burn and no one would care. I remember even watching, there was a Blade Runner documentary that they were doing, like, the 10th re-release of Blade Runner. And they're going back, well, what else can we add to Blade Runner? Well, if we, go into this old warehouse and archive, we might find old film strips and stuff of it that we've kind of forgot about. I mean, this is Blade Runner, one of the most important films ever. And, the outtakes and B-reel and stuff was still treated like crap. Even into the this isn't Peplum related, it's just my kind of philosophy, but even in the 90s, you have the infamous Event Horizon. Everyone wants a better Event Horizon cut. But no one cared at the time to kind of keep that stuff, preserve it. It saddens me that now it's like, well, how do we release a better version? We got to put a Criterion type version out. What did we do? Well, we treated films like crap back then. We don't really have anything. Oh, so kind of going back to the Italian knockoffs, even the VHS era of like Peplum and other films, some of those films only survive as a VHS copy. There's nothing on a Netflix or a streaming service. Old Peplum films are washed out, choppy from Alpha Video or something. And it's sad, but I don't know what to be done about it. I cross my fingers that someday, prints will come up, because just imagine being back in the 60s, watching these films on a big screen, the equivalent of an IMAX experience. So one of the reasons I try to give it a lot of love, I'm very passionate about I'm going to call it underdog cinema, because it becomes underdog cinema.
Sure. I mean, you talk about like the sincerity of things, and that's a conversation that Bernie and I have had many times on the podcast and off of, there's an earnestness to how some of these things get created, and they may not be the highest art. They may not be the best movie. I was listening to your episode talking about You're the Hunter from the Future. So again, by many metrics, not a good movie, but there is something to it that you keep coming back to, whether it's Red Brown's yelling, what have you, what's the mishmash of the genre. There's something there. There's something to it, and and it's a fun experience. And you can take something like that, and you can find merit in that. You can find value in that, just the same as you can alongside something like Ridley Scott's Gladiator. Which are worlds apart in terms of filmmaking and all that, but there's something there regardless.
I'm pretty sure we're probably going to be talking about specific films here in a second, but on your point, I want to share one thing. It is this book, Stephen Thrower's Nightmare USA. This book changed me. A lot of folks will ask, well, what's a book that's like changed you or had a big influence on you? This book, it weighs 100 pounds. It's huge, but it's about exploitation films of the 70s and early 80s. Before I read this book came out in the mid 2000s. Before I read this book, I'm just going to be honest, I was more of a film snob, which is ironic because when I was growing up, I grew up in the 90s. I had every media known to person. We lived out in the boonies. We had a satellite dish, which was as big as like a SETI satellite dish. So we had HBO, Cinemax, and our small town had a VHS rental place. And so we were flush with content. And that's how I saw Beastmaster and a lot of films growing up, a lot of very bad films, a lot of full moon films. But for some odd reason, when I went to college, I became kind of a snob. I'm not sure why. It only lasted a little bit, but I didn't have a lot of appreciation for the genre cinema, the exploitation cinema, the knockoff cinema. I just kind of view it's fun, but it's not that important, or it fills a niche. It's not my thing. But somehow or another, I when I started my master's degree, and I was still kind of up in the air what I wanted to study, and I wound up studying Italian cinema. Side note, it was Suspiria. It's all about Dario Argento's Suspiria. That's the movie that sucked me into Italian films. But I picked up this Nightmare USA book, which is all these, I don't want to call them terrible, because you'll see why in a second, but all these really bad, horror films like Don't Go Into the Woods and Axe. But every chapter goes into these films, talking to the filmmakers at the time. And every one of these filmmakers, they didn't set out to make a bad film. They were all earnest people like, we really want to make a film. We want to be filmmakers. We want to create something. And almost every story ends the same of, back then, everything was shot on film. We didn't have HDI like we do now, and processing film was a ginormous cost. So what would happen? Well, a sneaky distributor would come in and like, I'll distribute your film, and they'll take it and edit it and take the rights, and they're left with nothing except for a crappy film. And it wasn't just a one-time occurrence. It was every film I was reading in Nightmare USA. And it made me appreciate that no one really sets out to make a bad film. Even a knockoff film, you have to have some sort of competency behind it. You look at some of the knockoff films of the 60s and 70s and 80s of Italy, well, you have some powerhouse names behind it. The aforementioned Bava, Argento, Margheriti, Freda, Umberto Lenzi. I mean, they even Joe D'Amato. They all have a craftsmanship. Yeah, sure, they cranked out genre fare, but they knew what they were doing. And even if they looked at their own films as a cash grab, there's still, I don't want to call it an auteur element, but there's still a trademark to what they do. Not trademark, a hallmark. That's the word I'm looking for. The people that did the scores for these films, there are so many wonderful scores of the era. A lot of the writers would go on to make other, write for other films. Even the special effect. I mean, yeah, they're knockoff cinema, but again, they have heart, I think. Even side note, not Italian, even the Roger Corman films, they have a little bit of heart to them. So, wow. Were we talking about Peplum films at one point? I'm sorry.
No, but I think it's actually a perfectly natural evolution in that discussion, Nick, because a lot of these movies, like, right, again, the high culture, low culture, right? Like Pete, you mentioned Gladiator. So, yes. And a movie that we kind of, have loved, like You're the Hunter from the Future, not nearly as well known or the blockbuster that was Gladiator. But it's interesting because then as we've aged, right, as we saw those movies maybe as kids with maybe with not a big frame of reference, right? So like Nick, you were talking about your experience. I grew up watching some of these films, the full moon films, and then when you get to college, you start kind of expanding your palette. You meet other people who say, oh, if you like this, you may also like that. And it just changes your experience. It opens up your aperture a bit, so you can take in maybe other, like you said, other films, other cultures. Like I saw Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with my dad, who was a fan of Bonanza and Gunsmoke. But then to see Sergio Leone, and like you said, then there's that auteur in Sergio Leone in those movies. But then to go to college and find out about Akira Kurosawa.
Yes.
And then you start like, wait a second, what is this Yojimbo and Seven Samurai thing? Wait, this thing is kind of connected to all this. Like, there's this connective tissue behind this. But then kind of like the revisionist history is, so now we see a Your Hunter from the Future. Maybe it's not a Criterion edition, but it's now a 4K version with a Reb Brown commentary track. Why? Because maybe, there are those people like us who have now grown to appreciate these movies that were forgotten, and they've gotten maybe a second life. I'd like to think, it's kind of bad. There's a John Carpenter quote where someone says like, oh, all these people love your films. And his response is, oh, I wish they loved them when they had first come out. So in some ways, where maybe some of this, Peplum cinema, while forgotten, disregarded, not nearly as respected as some of the bigger Hollywood blockbusters, now through people like you, people who are passionate, who are ambassadors to this, kind of bring them up to the forefront. But there's people out there that say, yeah, you know what? Sure, we could make a Jason and the Argonauts 4K special edition, and people like myself, Pete, I imagine you, Nick, who were fans of that movie, will be like, yes, I would love to see that. But I would also just happily put a copy of Red Sonja on 4K on my shelf, because that was a big part of my childhood as well.
Well, and I think, the thing that I keep coming back to, and, and I think, Nick, you talked about this in your book as well, when you talked about like some of the, the features that separate, old school Peplum from the neo Peplum. You talk about television, technology, community, and you've got like the rise of, online communities that, I think when from a different era, there were these pockets of people, but there was no way to connect together. And I think, not to just keep touting on your and Gladiator, but just to use those two as examples, you run into someone, you could probably have a fairly interesting conversation about Gladiator, or, just in general, like, oh yeah, that was a good movie, Russell Crowe, good job, blah, blah, blah. You run into someone to talk about it's a different conversation. There's an energy to it. There's a passion there. So when you find that person that's like, oh my God, I love your as well. It's just two different conversations that you could have. One is just, can blossom like you were talking about, Bernie. Then all of a sudden you're talking about, well, have you seen this? And have you seen that? And then it branches out in a way that I think that, some of those other films, you might run into more of a dead end in conversation.
Well, let's go to Gladiator real quick, because I think that's a really important film. But I want to bring this up. Close your eyes for a minute and remember the last time you watched Gladiator, and ask yourself honestly, is Gladiator truly a good film, or is it just a really high budget, well-crafted genre film? I ask that because as good as Gladiator is, it's got powerhouses behind it. Russell Crowe, Ridley Scott, the sets are all amazing. But if you really think about it, Gladiator it's not a complex film. We're not going into David Lynch territory here. This is just the normal riches to rags to riches kind of film in a weird sort of way. The fallen person becomes the gladiator, and all of a sudden as the gladiator becomes, a bigger, even more powerful than Joaquin Phoenix. But if you think about it, that's a plot that you would really see in a 1960s Peplum. And I say that just because if you really think about it, Gladiator, if Italy back in the day had the budget and the technology to do it, Gladiator would be indistinguishable from 1960s Peplum films, if you ask me. It just happened to be, filmed by Ridley Scott, and there's Blade Runner and all this other stuff to it. And Gladiator is it's a good film. I love it. Although the soundtrack gets a lot more love for it than I think it should. I don't know why. Howard Zimmerman is not on his A game in that one, but that's beside the point. It truly is. It's truly a high budget 1960s Peplum film. It's not a complex film. It's just a very well crafted genre film. And I don't think a lot of people kind of realize that. I do. And there's nothing wrong with realizing that. I think it's a nice stamp that if I may kind of not retract, but there's that argument that horror cinema, I'm switching focus here for a second, like horror cinema isn't that good. They don't get Academy Awards. Yeah, sure, they make money, but they're kind of looked down on it. Now, Peplum cinema, it's kind of the same way. Can you think of a 1960s Peplum film that got awards? No, it's a genre fair. But here's a Gladiator. It snuck in. It got, accolades and money galore. But really, peel back the veneer of it, it is really indistinguishable from, something like Hercules or Messalina or any of those other kind of films of the era.
That made me think that I was sorry to interrupt. It just made me think of Titanic in the ways that if you peel away the James Cameron and the Leonardo DiCaprio, it's basically, what is it? It's just another disaster film. I mean, it's obviously, much more beloved than Armageddon, or was it Airport? I think in the 70s, or all of those. The Inferno. I forget the one with the boat that goes under. And
Tide Adventure.
Thank you. That's exactly right. Like, but by all terms, like, isn't Titanic exactly that? But with all the trappings of something that's maybe more accessible to the masses because of the way it's packaged, just like Gladiator. Yeah, with Horner, with Scott, with Russell Crowe at the time. You're just putting together something that people are going to be able to enjoy, and they don't see it through the lens of, wait, isn't this just like Conquest or Masters of the Universe? Isn't this like the same thing? It's like, oh no, this is different. It's like, well, how is it different?
It's just different in that, again, how it's packaged, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. If done correctly, as it did for me, it becomes a conduit to start exploring what came before it, what are similar movies to it. I take a kind of a networked, globalized view of things. What I mean by that is when something comes out and I really like it, I dive deep into it. I want to know where it's its influences, what are other things make. I like to joke, I'm the only person that when Napster was out, I actually used Napster to actually find new bands instead of Metallica albums and stuff. Because back then, I would get an album, I would look at who produced it, who remixed it, let me see what else they did. I feel that same way about cinema. It's a very networked feel to it. And so, like, Gladiator to me was a nice gateway to 80s sword and sorcery, 60s Peplum, a whole bunch of other stuff. Some folks don't go that route, and that's perfectly okay, because guess what? Gladiator fulfilled its function as, I hate to say it, a genre film. It entertained. It put a butt in the seat. You walked away happy. And at the end of the day, isn't that almost 90% of cinema anyway? Unless you're David Lynch. David Lynch is his own, all those other folks are their own thing. At the very end of the day, a lot of cinema is just genre cinema. And I think if you view it that way, it makes things a little bit more palpable. It makes things a little less serious. It makes things a little bit more, you can talk about things and not feel left out. And I think it also increases film appreciation, if that makes sense. So you don't have to have a highbrow or a gatekeeping type attitude. It's just every film has to entertain at some point. And I don't know.
No, that makes sense. I mean, you get something like Conan that becomes incredibly popular and then allows us to have Hundra, or you have Gladiator, and because of Gladiator we get 300 or the Immortals or Troy, King Arthur, Pathfinder, the Clash of the Titans remake, and then the follow-up Wrath. But even video games like God of War, and some of those, because Gladiator either gets the sword and sandal / Peplum / sword and sorcery conversation back in the zeitgeist, people say, hey, well, what if we just looked at it from this angle? But even TV shows where I grew up watching Hercules and Xena. And, because of the success of those, and maybe in the same ways, the landscapes that were provided by New Zealand that were provided to those Italian filmmakers, right? In like maybe in Italy, right? Where you have like this, you have actual columns in the background. It's easy to fill the landscape. Well, if you're in New Zealand, you can shoot Beastmaster, or I think it was Conan the Adventurer, Spartacus, Rome, Vikings, all of those on the backs of other things that were, like you said, they opened up the gates for masses to be like, hey, if you like this Hercules, you might like this tongue-in-cheek episodic version of Hercules as well.
I like to view Gladiator as the Hercules of the late 90s, early 2000s, because you're correct that it opened up the cycle for 300, Spartacus, Rome, a lot of those other films. But even Gods of Egypt and films like that, the only kind of bleh thing about it, the Eagle, is the cycle really tapered off. And I think part of it's been replaced by superhero films. If you think about it, a lot of old Peplum films are mythological based, Hercules and all those other deities. Well, what are they? They're basically superheroes. So modern day superhero films, the MCU and the DC universe, kind of fill that want, right, wrong, or indifferent. I kind of see the superhero films as the successor of the neo-Peplum right now. That kind of saddens me because I like the genre so much. But then you step back, all the other platforms out there still embrace it. Video games find success with the sword and sandals genre. I mean, Assassin's Creed Odyssey was an incredible game that, made a lot of money and had a lot of acclaim to it. I mean, the game Hades just came out, what was it, a year or two ago? People love that game. Comics are still cranking out Peplum, books, even more literature type stuff. So I find it kind of surviving in other platforms. And it just seems like the Peplum genre nowadays, it has to piggyback onto something. So you'll have like the Percy Jackson stuff. I mean, for all purposes, to me, that's neo-Peplum. Yeah, it's modern day, but guess what? You got Greek deities there and stuff. It piggybacks on it. So it finds a way to still be sneaky. One other thing I want to bring up, I didn't bring it up in my book, but this is a paper in the making. I want to bring up the importance of Mystery Science Theater 3000 to Peplum. Because, one, they gave us, I'm a big MST3K fan. I watched it on the Sci-Fi Channel before I watched it on Comedy Central. So Mike Nelson is my host. I know there's debates out there, but MST3K gave a life to like Hercules and the Moon Men and a whole bunch of other Peplum. But one of the things that it did that other people don't really talk about is, to me, it recreates that experience of watching Peplum, but I'll just say any Italian genre cinema of the 60s. And I say that because, I mean, MST3, it creates that theater experience. I mean, you have the shadows in front of you of the seats, of the bots. Well, for all purposes, you are in the satellite of love. You are in a theater. Well, how's that different than going to, a cinema in a small town in Italy, watching a Giallo or a Mario Bava horror film? I mean, people are going to talk through the movie because it's again, this isn't high art here. This is genre cinema. Back then, theater going was a bit more communal thing. So it's sort of like nowadays, if you catch a midnight film or a grindhouse film. I remember watching Big Lebowski at a midnight screening, and it was just awesome because people were talking through the film. People were laughing through the film and kind of not riffing it, but appreciating it. I mean, usually when you think of a theater going experience, you want to be in a dark room, shut everything else out, focus on the film, take it all in. Well, it wasn't, I mean, that's good for a lot of cinema, but a lot of other cinema is communal based. There's a reason why we grab the popcorn and get on the couch and watch things with other folks. And to me, Mystery Science Theater 3000 does that. To me, it just recreates this experience of cinema paradiso, of being in a theater in the 60s Italy, watching, well, in this case, it'd be an English dub of a film, but riffing it, having fun. And to me, I think that I don't want to say underhandedly, it's not the right word, but sneakily adds this unintended appreciation for these films, giving it an experience that you'd walk away with that you didn't even know that you wanted. And plus, it's MST3K. It's fun.
Oh, no. As a fellow Misty, thank you for bringing up MST3K, because one of the first MST3K episodes I ever watched was Cave Dwellers.
Yes.
And that was my introduction to Aitor and Miles O'Keefe. And, in some of those, I guess I'll call them classic episodes compared to some of the more modern ones. But like you mentioned, Hercules versus the Moon Men, Outlaw of Gore. That was my introduction to that. And then realizing that it was a book series and in a way, kind of like this offshoot, similar and parallel to like John Carter of Mars. But some of the newer MST2K episodes, Wizards of the Lost Kingdom parts 1 and 2, and then Loves of Hercules with Mickey Hargitay. Like some of those movies, I'm glad that they chose to continue that sword and sandal addition to Mystery Science Theater 3K, because for me, while I love a lot of episodes of the show, but some of those are the ones that I can watch over and over again for the exact reasons that you mentioned. It reminds me of a bunch of my buddies in somebody's basement watching a movie like Beastmaster and riffing on it, but giving that up to the bots and Mike or Joel and just letting them do it for me professionally and way better than me and my buddies ever did. But just having that other introduction to this genre that, along with everything else of the biker movies, the comedies, the sci-fi films that they did, to be like, oh yeah, Peplum, Sword and Sandal were as much a part of MST3K. And for me, it sounds like for you, obviously, and you have more expertise in this genre. Like, yeah, this is important, and it's cool that we're able to piggyback in a different way.
Going back to MST3K, I have found, because through venues like MST3K, of horror movie hosts, of just being with other people, midnight screenings, when people riff a film, it's always been with adoration and affection. Even a terrible film like Manos Hands of Fate, I'm not the biggest fan of that film. I think it's really grody, but I understand what it does. But I've never seen anything malicious for it. I've only seen appreciation. In fact, I'll tell a little story here, because we brought up Yor a couple times. Yor is a guilty pleasure. I think I call it a psychotronic film without being a psychotronic film, because there's this enthusiasm about it and surrealness, how Red Brown goes from civilization to civilization in that film, and everyone his path he crossed accidentally dies. It's such a catastrophic film, but he has this big grin on his face. But the thing is I was at a convention over a decade ago, and Red Brown was there, and I'm like, oh my God, it's Red Brown. You look at the celebrity list beforehand. I want to meet Red Brown. He was in Yor. He was in Strike Commando. But at the same time, you're like, what is his viewpoint on, starring in what would be quote unquote, bad films? I'm like, risk versus reward. So I went to this convention. Red Brown was there, and I brought in my MST3K box set that had Space Mutiny in it. Brought in my German import of Yor, because Yor hadn't seen a nice Blu-ray release yet. I brought in Strike Commando, which was on this budget release. And I went up to him, and his eyes lit up, because even though they were bad films, and again, quote unquote bad films, I love these films. He was so happy to sign them and talk about them. In fact, when we listened to the Yor commentary a couple weeks ago, I'm like, he told us that story. And, for from his perspective, from a production's perspective, he's out in Italy having the time of his life, getting paid big bucks to star in a bad film. While an appreciator like me is, having a good time watching these films. So, and I've met a fair share of celebrities who are embarrassed by, whatever films they've been in. But, I found for a lot of Italian films, Peplum films, or whatever, a lot of the surviving folks have nothing but like affection and enthusiasm for these films. I met John Saxon at a convention, and I brought him like Italian, Cannibal Apocalypse. He's like, oh yeah, Cannibal Apocalypse. I was in that film. It was a great film. I got treated like a king. And it's just kind of funny when you have both sides of the coins, the people who made the film and the watchers of the film when they're all on the same page of, even though at the end of the day, this is a genre, low budget film for all purposes should be, I don't want to say reviled, but I am going to say reviled. Yet there's this kind of unity to it that everyone at the end of the day still appreciates what it is, got something out of it, had fun with it. And in the case of like some spaghetti westerns, even in the aftermath, gets elevated to fine cinema. I mean, the Dollars trilogy at its base is still a genre cinema. Once Upon a Time in the West is still a genre cinema, but it got elevated. It got rescued from genre cinema to be, here's an auteur film. Here's a film worthy of studying. Watch the first 5 minutes of Once Upon a Time in the West and see filmmaking at its finest. Well, I think that's inherent in a lot of these cycles, ripoffs, sequels, remakes, and so on and so forth.
It's always great to hear someone talk so passionately about this stuff, and obviously you are one such person. But I'm just curious. You may have kind of talked about this a little bit, but what was it about this genre that or how did you first get into this? Like, what was the thing like that you saw? What was your experience where you're like, I need to immerse myself in this, and I need to know everything there is to know about Peplum?
Completely by accident. So when I went back to school to get my master's, I was kind of on the fence of what I was going to study. And then I wound up watching Suspiria, which opened up the Italian film gates. And I just fell in love with Antonio Margheriti films. I still think Ark of the Sun God is probably my third all-time favorite film. And I mean that unironically. So back in the 2000s, I was so hardcore in Italian cinema. I was scooping up a lot of stuff. But, I was fresh from getting my master's degree. And what were you going to do with it? Well, I want to be an academic writer. Aside from the day job, I want to write academically. And I told myself, well, Nick, you need to make some essays for some other books and then tackle a book by yourself. And that happened. I wrote an essay on Eurospy films. I wrote an essay on meteorite horror films. And it came the day, Nick, you need to do a book yourself. And so at the time, I was hardcore into some industrial music, some neo-folk music and whatnot. No one else has talked about this stuff. I'm going to do a book on this. And so I spent months crafting like the most perfect letter of intent, proposal. Here's the stuff I want to do. Here's the outlets to promote it at. I put together this package to go to my publisher, McFarlane. And but what happened was I didn't have a plan B just in case. And at the time, a movie came out called Gods of Egypt. I watched Gods of Egypt. I like Gods of Egypt. I have a soft spot for the director. I stand by Dark City is one of the greatest films ever made.
Oh, Alex Proyas, sure.
Yeah, and I love that film. I side note, I see Gods of Egypt as like an unofficial sequel to Dark City because there's that sequence in Gods of Egypt. They pull back. There's ancient Egypt that's just a floating coin in space. I'm like, that's this Dark City. Come on. but there was some newspaper articles about, representation in these films. Like, there's a whole bunch of white people in Gods of Egypt. And is that a right thing to do? Shouldn't you cast better representation? I'm like, that is an important question. I remember being in a car with my girlfriend kind of talking about that. And I'm like, where do you take this dialogue from? There's some important stuff to stay there. And then at the time also, Hail Caesar came out. I loved Hail Caesar. And I remember watching this is really a sword and sandal film in the 50s. I mean, just close your eyes during any scene with Brolin and you have a sword and sandal film for all purposes. Isn't that kind of neat? And so it's those two films that kind of came out at the same time that made me thinking, there's something important here. And so my plan B at the time was, I will do a book on, I'm going to call it Neo-Peplum films, all these kind of sword and sandal films that I'd gotten exposed to through MST3K, through my Antonio Margaretti studies, all these post-Gladiator films. You know what? I think I spent one night because I didn't really care at the time, but it was my plan B. I haphazardly put together, here, these post-Gladiator films. No one else has talked about them. They're fun. And that's the one my publisher went with.
Of course.
And so So here's the deal. When I'm on the hook for something, I dive into it. And so now I have a contract for a Is Peplum book that, I'd seen 300, I'd seen Gladiator, I'd seen Gods of Egypt. I'd grown up on Hercules and Xena. I'd studied sword and sandal stuff through Antonio Margaretti, but let's really dive into this. And so when you actually do a project, you gain so much more appreciation for these films. Even the worst of the worst, you still wind up loving these films in the end, because other people, because my book, The New Peplum, I didn't write that one. It's an edited collection by other folks, but I still have to peer review it. I still have to go through this. I still have to watch the movies that these are based on. So it was just basically a huge crash course in all forms of Peplum to make that book. But of course, what does that do? That opens up the doors for, I was already in that 80s Italian cinema. Let's watch even more of those. Let's watch The Barbarians. Let's watch these Ruggero Deodato films, or so on and so forth. And so I would say that's probably what got me to the cinema, even more so than I was before, is just this kind of that fluke of nature of, Gods of Egypt of all films coming out. Just kind of did the domino stuff. And I think that's, if I could sum it up, that's kind of my entire ethos of my academic writing is once I find kind of a really niche topic, I really dive into it. And at the end of the day, I wind up appreciating it more, liking it more. I actually get lit up to see stuff. 15 years ago, I could probably have played Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I'm like, this is a good game. Now I play Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I'm like, I know something about this. Oh, I know where this is coming from. I can appreciate this more. So I think that's the long way of saying, how did I get into this game anyway?
Well, I was going to, Nick, with you in the book, is it Paul Johnson? He has an essay and he talks about Sword and Planet.
Yes.
And to that exact point you just made. So I'm a comics fan. Sounds like you are as well. And so you're aware of Planet Hulk. Yep. And seeing something I'd mentioned John Carter of Mars, you'd mentioned and Paul in the book, Jupiter's Legacy. Mm-hmm. I guess even now you could say the new Wonder Woman, especially the scenes in Themyscira, but Thor Ragnarok taking pieces of Planet Hulk. But exactly what you said, when I read Planet Hulk as the comic, hey, I see the Conan, I see the Beastmaster, I see some of the things that they're kind of alluding to. So it's I get your references. And mm-hmm. There's something really interesting in that. It seems like when you're watching a movie, a TV series, or a game, and there is a connection, mm-hmm. whether it's from a more neo-Peplum perspective, yep. where it's kind of taking pieces of it, or Paul had said in the book, the Sword and Planet, where it kind of takes some of it, but now maybe there's spacefaring adventure type angle to it. Mm-hmm. But you're seeing the roots, the seeds of how this all kind of came to be.
That Paul Johnson essay was a real eye-opener for me, because at the time I had my call for papers open for that book, and Paul Johnson had submitted this to me, and I read it. I'm like, Tron 2, Jupiter Ascending? What does that have to do with Sword and Sandal? And so I initially I was going to reject the essay, just because I couldn't see, I had the blinders on still, I guess, or maybe I still was in a very, that's the thing about genre cinema, is sometimes you get in a very niche focus. This is a Peplum film. This is the narrow definition of it. Here's a very narrow definition of a zombie film, of a vampire film, and so on and so forth. But I emailed him back. I'm like, I'm on the fence about this, but tell me a bit more about it. And he did. I'm like, okay, I see where you're getting at. is ultimately the goal of the book, and I didn't even realize it, that, yeah, Tron 2, is Tron 2 a sword and sandal film? No, it's not a sword and sandal film. But if you look at it through these lenses and you start seeing the homages, wait a second, there's some stuff here that definitely does go back to, Grecian and Roman antiquity. Same with the John Carter film, which is a bit more lifted. The Sword and Planet genre is definitely way more indebted to Sword and Sandal. Even Jupiter Ascending, as a side note, Jupiter Ascending was one of those films I went into a cinema to watch a completely different film, and I saw the poster on the wall, like, coming soon, Jupiter Ascending. I'm like, oh, Wachowskis, this is going to be a great film. I know it. And I watch it, like, oh, this movie is so terrible. I do not like Jupiter Ascending at all. And then here's my book. Here's an author writing about Jupiter Ascending. I better watch Jupiter Ascending. And then, 180. I'm like, okay, I'm seeing the Peplum elements here. I mean, the guy that's basically, air walking with his boots. That's freaking Ares. Come on. I mean, the architecture, this is totally Grecian. There's seriously an Odyssean story here at its core. And all it takes is that kind of eye-opening, reading someone else's perspective and their viewpoint, and then at the end, peer editing it and publishing it, that makes you do a 180 that really opens up to, okay, this movie isn't that bad. Yeah, it's bad, but, through it, it still accomplishes this stuff. It still entertains. It still does things. In this case, from my Peplum studies, it advances it. So I can sit back now where before I would malign something like Jupiter Ascending. Now I'll watch it and I'll be like, okay, it's still bad, but I love it because I know something about this. I helped edited a book that put out something in the world that helped elevate this film from bad reviews and whatnot, that there is something I appreciate about it. And as a side note from Jupiter Ascending, I'm also an unapologetic Speed Racer fan. I actually think that movie's a legit good film.
It is. I agree.
Well, and I always find it interesting because I came of age. I'm probably a generation older than both of you. So, I mean, I saw Star Wars in the drive-in. I have a very distinct memory of being upstate New York, and my uncle and cousin were like, hey, we're going to go to the drive-in. We're going to go see Conan the Barbarian. Do you want to go? And I'm like, of course. But I was, it was rated R movie. I was like, I think 10 at the time, but my parents let me go. And so I have this very vivid memory of getting to see Conan the Barbarian in the drive-in when I'm 10 years old. And so that is like a huge imprint. And so I think there's like the mashup there of like, obviously Star Wars being a massive influence on me, running around the woods, pretending to be Han Solo. And then you've got Conan the Barbarian. So like when I see, and having this conversation, I start to see like Ice Pirates and like these movies that I grew up with and enjoy. Like, and we talked about Krull on a earlier podcast about a movie that I kind of liked at the time, but I don't know if I want to go back and revisit it now. But now I think I'm reversing myself. And now I think I really do want to go back and see it because I'm kind of doing that dive back in now of movies that I haven't seen in a long time or that I missed the first time around. A lot of like, I even was thinking like Time Bandits. There's that one vignette when he comes in and he lands on the Minotaur and Sean Connery's battling the Minotaur in ancient Greece there. Like, I'm like, there's these things that I'm picking up on now that I think I just, when I was younger, just took for granted because it was just fun fantasy space. It was all of that mashed up into one and just having that active imagination. I was there for all of it. And now being older, I can go back and look at it with a different lens and appreciate it in a different way.
See, I don't think they're mutually exclusive, though. You can have both.
I agree. Yeah, for sure.
I could totally sit back and watch Beastmaster and Kroll and still have the little kid giddiness of it. A side note, Kroll, the soundtrack for that is great to play Dungeons and Dragons too. But yeah, definitely later on after, that's the thing about cinephiles, I think, and I don't mean academic cinephiles, I guess I do, but anyone who just kind of submerges themselves into zine culture or underground film culture, they do pick up that additional appreciation that they can go back to the films of the 80s. And I would even say 90s now. I think there's hopefully there's an appreciation of 90s direct to HBO films that will happen. I mean, the 90s was the golden era of, what do I call them? The erotic thrillers that doesn't even exist anymore, that I think people are getting around to. You know what? There's something kind of good about those films. But yeah, I mean, the 80s, Conan, Deathstalker. Okay, if you were 10 years old and watched Deathstalker, you saw a lot of nudity. But I still think that those films, through nostalgia, still bring out a big inner kid. And at the same time, you can still juggle with, okay, I see where this is coming from. I see the cinematic heritage that led to Conan. And a side note, I mean, Conan is the byproduct of two lineages. It is the byproduct of Sword and Sandal films. Because even though Sword and Sandal films kind of ended in the 60s to be replaced by Euro spy and spaghetti Western, it did get its reboot because of Conan. And for all purposes, even though Conan has some magical elements, it's still a Sword and Sandal film. It's got a strong man in its central character with Arnold Schwarzenegger. It has a very medieval even Bronze era age feel to it. For all purposes, it's a high budget Peplum film. And all the movies that came by. In fact, I don't want to diminish Conan, because I do like Conan. It is kind of a by the numbers Sword and Sandal film, though. And it took like movies after it to really bolster it. Like right now, your background's Beastmaster. I would say, comparing Beastmaster to Conan is a movie that does less with more, while Beastmaster does more with less. And I say that because you watch Beastmaster, there is some trippy stuff in Beastmaster. You got like the bat guys that digest people outside them, and of course you've got Mark Singer talking to animals. You've got the Aztec pyramid that they do sacrifices at. That's kind of reminiscent of the James Earl Jones Temple and Conan, but there is just so much more. I don't want to say wackiness, but I don't know any other term to it that Beastmaster has when compared to Conan, where Conan is pretty straightforward. Again, not to diminish Conan. Conan's a great film, but like Beastmaster really took some chances on a very low budget. And I love Don Coscarelli films. I'm sorry. But it's funny that genre, depending on your vision of it, your appreciation of it, because I mean, I've met Don Coscarelli at a con, and I got my singer, him autographing all my stuff, listen to his commentaries. I mean, Beastmaster is very indebted to the Sword and Sandal films, even says so as much. And so I think his appreciation comes out of it more than, say, John Milius, I can never say his last name, who's there to make, a film with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I get that, but going back to what we talked about earlier, the enthusiasm, the craftsmanship, the giddiness to make this type of film, Don Coscarelli has it. And I think it shows in a movie like Beastmaster. Well, Conan, again, is good, but it's very by the book, by the numbers. And then I think I said earlier, it comes from two lineages. It comes from a literary lineage as well. You've got the old sword. I mean, Robert E. Howard basically invented the sword and sorcery genre back in when he was writing not essays, short stories for Weird Tales. And a side note, you got to remember, in the 70s, I don't think enough people give this person credit. Lynn Carter, he was a writer and an editor. He really brought fantasy literature back into the limelight in the 70s, because before then, a lot of that stuff had been kind of forgotten. The old Lord Dunsany films, even Tolkien, was kind of forgotten at the time. But he brought this all back through Ballantine books. He brought all the sci-fi and fantasy stuff. So 70s saw this big renaissance of fantasy films. And I think it kind of corresponds with kind of post-hippie culture as well. But it laid this groundwork of fantasy's cool. You could see fantasy now on trippy, prog rock vinyl albums, our Frank Frazetta book covered Robert E. Howard re-releases. And I think it laid a nice groundwork for what would be Conan. And then Conan would come out with Beastmaster and Hundra and Deathstalker and so on and so forth. So there's that literary component that I don't think enough people talk about, that's right under the surface, that helped bring that 80s sword and sandal, sword and sorcery back to life.
It's interesting you said that, because with I'm thinking something like the Frazetta covers that are obviously so iconic in especially on those pulp novels that seem to be they're meant to be disposable, but those covers weren't. They were the inspiration for so many metal albums in the 70s and 80s. But that a young Robert Rodriguez was so inspired by those Frank Frazetta movies that he then tries to make, it doesn't happen, tries to essentially do a Red Sonja reboot, and that doesn't work. But in his work with Boba Fett and, the stuff now with Lucasfilms, there's pieces of the sword and sandal, like, yes, the Joseph Campbell Journey of a Hero, that's in there too. But there's those little pieces where, if you know The Man with No Name, if you know Conan, and you're watching something like The Mandalorian or Boba Fett, if you're aware of those references, you see it. It's all kind of screaming at you, because he's just kind of going back into his youth, into his pipeline, and be like, yeah, that movie I saw in the drive-in, and here's the thing. And if someone's seeing it now, and they're doing a deep dive in the same ways that like we have right now, like as we've gotten older, as we've gotten access to more films because of streaming, we can go back and look at these movies. And Pete, sorry, I did watch Ice Pirates again the other night, and I wanted it to live up again to what it was. It was a rough watch. It was a rough watch. Although I will say, to go back to your Reb Brown love, Nick, I did watch Mercenary Fighters, and that was a little bit more forgivable. Strike Commando, don't get me wrong, that was really good. But that, and what was it, the Snake movie that Reb Brown is in? I don't think he's in it for very long. But yeah, some of those movies that you see where, if you're listening to this episode, you're like, yeah, I don't know half the movies you guys are talking about, but they inspire filmmakers and other people, and in a way, like, you actually have seen some of this in probably some of the things that you love.
I mean, I know the original Star Wars, when people kind of break it down, the Akira Kurosawa films get the most love for its Star Wars films. But I remember rewatching Antonio Margaretti's Devil of the Desert versus the Son of Hercules, and its opening shots, I'm like, this is Tatooine. This is flat out Tatooine. I mean, I can't say that Lucas was inspired by that film specifically, but for sure that Lucas was definitely inspired by sword and sandal films. You watch Attack from the Clones, the whole arena battle there, that is a flat out / John Carter Sword and Planet / Hercules arena scene right there. I think very much of modern day cinema is very much indebted to 1960s Italian cinema, because back in the 60s, again, Italy was exporting so much films. And we had here in the States, we had folks that were very eager to import those films, because we had teenagers at the drive-ins. And of course, Saturday, Italy didn't have quite the television culture yet, but we had the television culture. How do you fill that airtime? How do you make a constant stream of fare in the drive-in? Well, here's some sword and sandal films. Okay, perfect. We'll take it. We'll redub it. We'll edit it. We'll cut it. And, I can only assume that so many filmmakers nowadays, let me rephrase that. The past generation of filmmakers nowadays saw those films in their youth. Now we have a second generation of filmmakers that are inspired by the first generation of filmmakers. But they're totally inspired by Italian genre cinema. I mean, I think every cowboy film now is more indebted to a spaghetti Western than a John Wayne film, for instance. Just because the spaghetti Westerns pushed it in directions it couldn't go. And the same thing with comic book films. I think they're very indebted to the Peplum films. They won't say it. I mean, but if you watch the kind of lineage of it, Peplum films, the Gladiator, Gladiator 2. As a quick side note, I'm also a big proponent of Gladiator needs a sequel. I'm okay if you bring Russell Crowe back, because guess what? In these old mythological Peplum films, people came alive all the time. You go down to Hades, bring them back. To me, it makes sense.
I think I was listening to an interview with Roger Corman, and he was talking about how he would marry some of his movies with bringing in like a Fellini film or a Kurosawa film to the, that was because he loved all of those films, and he realized that from an American audience standpoint, this was something that he felt the audience was missing out on. And I think there was probably, a dual reason for that. I think he also wanted to get his own films showcase, and that was one way that he could do it, was be like, well, I'm going to pair this as a double feature. But he was very conscious about bringing in, I think, certainly a lot of that Italian cinema to like give that an American audience a chance to see like, well, here's some great stuff coming from overseas, and also here's here's Death Race 2000 as well.
Not just Roger Corman, but I would also put Charles Band in that camp as well, because one, Charles Band's dad, Albert Band, he made Peplum films. He was an Italian filmmaker. And then two, Charles Band, at the time before Full Moon and before Empire, he had Wizard Video. Let's go with Wizard Video. And that's what he did. He imported a lot of films as well during the 80s. He brought a lot of those Italian films out there. And to me, Charles Band and Roger Corman, they operate from the same camp of exploitation horror cinema. But earlier, we're talking about the Frank Frazetta covers, how they sold stuff. I mean, they both come from the same camp of, let's sell a movie on a movie poster. Sure. Here's Puppet Master. I don't even have a movie yet. Here's Puppet Master. Here's the
Deathstalker series, like
exactly.
All of those cover art. It was like, I mean, if I was 12, 14, 15, I'd be, yes. I'm like, yeah, give me this. This looks amazing.
It's funny. I actually revisited Deathstalker a couple weeks ago because, hey, I got invited to a podcast. I might want to, tune up on some of this stuff. It was kind of funny how progressive and yet regressive Deathstalker was with its nudity. Conan, that's okay. Side note, let's backtrack a little bit because I brought up nudity. One of the things about Peplum films is the showcasing of a body. That is probably one of the most important things about a Peplum film. The earlier 1960s films, you had a strong man in its role. You had a Steve Reeves or an Alan Steele, and you had a male body on display. But one of the other things that you had on display was women bodies as well. 1960s Italy was still a very conservative era. You had Christian Democrats kind of in power, and they kind of controlled the purses of production at the time. But you were able to kind of circumnavigate some of this stuff. You could show nudity or sexuality or blood and gore as long as at the end of the film something got their comeuppance. So I remember doing my master's thesis on Castle of Blood with Barbara Steele, and that movie has necrophilia, it's got nudity, it's got blood and gore, but what happens at the end? Everyone dies. So that's cool. I mean, that's cool with a very religious society at the time. But Peplum films they fall in that category as well of, sure, you have a male body on display, but think of a lot of the women in Peplum films. They're covered in veils, they're very see-through, or they're in a bath or a waterfall scene, and you can't quite see anything, but you can still imagine what's going on. And you can do that to kind of get around censors or production mandates. And so the Peplum films were kind of progressive in that regard. I remember hearing some commentaries that Peplum films were made for children. And I get that. Once you get an American cut of it and you dub it and you take out kind of the risky parts, you have a Saturday afternoon film for kids, but through an adult eyes, you see seductresses, you see vamps, you see belly dancers, in the women's side of things. And on the male side of things, you see a lot of buttocks and pectorals and stuff like that. It is a very body forward genre, more so than almost any other genre, except for when you start getting into erotic and pornography genres. And then fast forward, we talk about Deathstalker. Deathstalker took what 60s Peplum films are doing and like, let's just go full out. If you're going to have a woman, let's just show everything. And I remember rewatching Deathstalker, like the main lady, when they first introduced her to the titular Deathstalker, she has her cloak on, but, her breasts are hanging out. And, it's interesting because there's two sides to that. One of it is, well, this is a society that doesn't care about nudity. And I think of movies like the Paul Verhoeven films like RoboCop and Starship Troopers, where you've evolved since then. You can have women and men in the locker room naked and there's no sexual harassment or objectifying. That's just you. Or the famous Starship Trooper scene where everyone's in the shower together and they're comrades. And so I'm watching Deathstalker and I see that scene where again, I forget the actress's name and the character's name. She just comes out, she just has a cloak and she has nudity. And I'm like, that's progressive. But then at the same time, all the other nudity in the film is so exploitation and sexualized. And there's some really strong rape undertones. Like, oh, that kind of destroyed what kind of progressiveness is going on here. So Deathstalker's kind of a really, how do I put it? It doesn't know what it wants to be film, but it had the chance to be something really progressive. But at the end of the day, though, it's still a great sword and sorcery film because, like Beastmaster, it does more with less. I think of the opening shot of all the orcs or whatever jumping over the title credits. It just, there again, that goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier. There is a craftsmanship, there is an artisanship, there's an enthusiasm about it.
And even when you get to like something like Deathstalker 2, which is so very tongue in cheek, and it and it, I'm fascinated by that movie as well. Like I keep going back and watching it because it feels like on some levels like it shouldn't exist, but it does. And from the accounts of, I forget the actor's name that plays Deathstalker and Deathstalker 2, but, he was talking about how they basically just would rewrite scenes and be like, well, we're just going to come up with our own dialogue. And so it's very, it's very 80s, but then it's almost like a commentary, because at that point they're kind of like, well, we're just going to kind of spoof these type of films. And certainly it's making fun of its predecessor, which, as you mentioned, like, it takes it's serious for the most part. I mean, there's maybe some unintentional comedy in there, but it makes it all very interesting just to talk about. You talk about like that, the progressiveness versus the exploitation. And so, it's complicated and it's difficult because it's almost trying to be two things at once. And so there's conflict there, but that makes for something interesting to talk about. I mean, it's, how can you not talk about something like that?
Well, you bring up a very interesting sentence when you say commentary. I recently, a couple months ago, I did a presentation at the Mid-Atlantic Popular and American Culture Association conference, and I was talking about a German agrotech band, not the greatest band, but this band used samples from the TV show Vikings in their music. And that's kind of a normal trademark of industrial music, is you sample films. But my research into that led me into a lot of research on Viking metal. And what does this have to do with Peplum? Well, one of the things I found while researching Viking metal is a lot of folks who appreciate Viking metal, who get something out of it, is because Viking metal, and I'm going to now expand this to just kind of any kind of medieval, antiquity, whatever, is there is something that in history there is a desired quality of it that is not in modern times. You're looking toward in ancient history, medieval times, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, Vikings in this example here, for a desired quality of life or an answer to a modern day problem. And I think the 80s and even the 60s for both the classic Italian sword and sandal cycle and the 80s with the sword and sorcery. And that's what it really was. It was sword and sorcery, which is a successor of sword and sandal. What were they answering? What was the commentary at the time, even unintended? What questions were they inherently answering that we didn't even know that we had? I always think of a movie as a vessel of its period. It is a time capsule to capture, I think the term is hegemony of the period. We look at a lot of retrowave and synthwave music and films, from Stranger Things to even Kung Fury. What kind of commentary is that on the 80s? Yeah, it's kind of idealized, but at the same time, the era of Reaganomics, Iran-Contra, bad view of looking down south with a lot of mercenary films and so on and so forth. The sword and sandal films and the sword and sorcery films are also, they accomplish the same things, just through an antiquity setting, that they are commentaries on their period. The sword and sandal films inherently have some sort of weird message about fascism, because, oh man, I'm kind of going all the map here. Think about this. Italy they were the bad guy in World War II. And now, it's 20 years later, they're now a higher power. They're going through an economic boom. They have currency in the world, and they're making, cultural artifacts. Well, how do you I don't want to say erase the past, but how do you deal with the past? Well, you can have a movie where a fascist person overthrows a country, and then Hercules comes in representing our Machista or Ursus or whoever, they're all interchangeable, comes in to represent the people to overthrow that person. And so that's how the 1960s Italian films can comment on things like fascism. What can the 1980s sword and sorcery films do? Well, here's an era of excess, of the perceived yuppie culture, drug culture, whatever you want. I mean, the movie American Psycho kind of sums it up. Let me say this: perceived 80s. Well, here's some films that kind of go to, quote unquote, a simpler but still magical time that maybe people kind of yearn for. And of course, we have that in our cartoons. We talked about this offline, Thunder the Barbarian, He-Man, and so on and so forth, that you can take kind of a dark cloud, in this case, very late stage Cold War mentality, and, put it into something tangible. I can't comprehend ICBMs looking at me, but I sure as heck can, comprehend Rip Torn about to sacrifice someone in Beastmaster. And so when you say commentary, that, people look to their artifacts for answers, either a desired state, escapism, nostalgia, all the above. Here we go.
No, I would 100% agree that the comment in the book, because the fourth part is the sculpted in marble gender and representation. So your commentary about the body kind of being on display, and like you said, on both sides, right? The muscular hero, but also the warrior women, the barbarian queens that they show, and kind of having that be on screen for prepubescent kids. And that's where I was going to ask you, Pete, in your memories, as you talked about seeing Conan at the drive-in, I know Beastmaster has a special place in your heart, and the fact that you talk about this in your intro to Nick, the whole hey, Beastmaster's on, is it's like a kind of a jokey take on what Beastmaster was at the time to HBO, but how big of a touchstone it was to audiences like us. When I would go to my cousin's house and Beastmaster was inevitably on, and I would not mind watching it for the 10th, 12th time, because it was a warm blanket. It like I knew what was going to happen, and I wanted to watch it again and again and again. So I'm wondering, Pete, like, what are some of the movies that are like in this Peplum world that meant something more to you? Whatever era it was, whether it was before you, after you, or even more of a modern day.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, in preparing for this episode, I've started to dive back in and starting to discover some films that I just missed. I saw it's a Riff Tracks version, but I just started watching The Sword and the Sorcerer, and and I always have like these weird touch points, like Hawk the Slayer, like the lead actor in that I remember from being in Full Metal Jacket as like the Stars and Stripes editor. And so it's like I'm having like these weird things. I'm like, I picture him with a Southern accent, like Sword and the Sorcerer. The main, like Lee Horsley, is Matt Houston from the 1980s. Like he's a detective. So there's like all these crazy things. But as I said, having experienced Conan the Barbarian at the age that I did, Beastmaster again, HBO. All the time, like it was just on always, and and you would just watch it, and like I agree, Bernie. There was a blanket and a comfort to that. Time Bandits, another movie that maybe doesn't quite fall into that, but has the elements there. For me, it was having a creative mind and a sense of adventure. Like these were adventure tales that I could very easily insert myself into and want to be a part of that world. I look at some of these, and again, budget, not necessarily being budget dependent, but if the filmmaker was able to create some world building, I was in. I was just, it was very easy for me to look past, the shoddy props or the location settings and things like that. I just fell right into the storytelling, the hero's journey, like going on a quest. Here's the quest that I need to save the kingdom, save the realm, whatever it happens to be. When I was younger, I definitely just fell into that category just right away. That was kind of where my brain always went, and that's just kind of where I let those films take me.
If you think about it, though, those films are very conducive for the childhood. I mean, what's easier for a kid to do? To pick up a stick outside and think it's a sword, or to try and imagine that they have a blaster or something? There's just something inherently about sword and sorcery, sword and sandal, sword and planet, and even high fantasy that, you could go outside. There's trees, there's mountains, it's so much easier to escape into a distant past, to imagine yourself. I mean, there's a reason why more people play Dungeons and Dragons than, say, Cyberpunk. And I mean the RPG, not the video game, or Shadow. I forget what's that? Is
it Shadowrun?
Yeah, Shadowrun. I'm sorry. I as much as I love Shadowrun, that we can envision ourselves in a more historic past, that we can integrate ourselves into it. And I don't want to discourage the plot of these films, but they are fairly black and white. The good guys are good, the bad guys are bad, the heroes are heroes. I mean, that sort of ambiguity wouldn't come into play until you got to the spaghetti Western era, where, there was some moral dubiousness of it. Now, I don't mean that negatively. You could have a good guy that had a bad side to it. You didn't have that in a Peplum film. You would not have a bad Hercules. You wouldn't have a bad Ursus.
Yeah.
And because of that, I think it made the world a little bit black and white, but it also makes it easier for us, impressionable kids to take in, that we can see the world that way and also integrate ourselves in the world that way. I mean, I remember growing up thinking, playing a game like Legend of Zelda, and then I could go outside and like all of a sudden, I grew up in the mountains. I grew up in a small town in Washington, and guess what? My backyard was Hyrule. I mean, that's a lot easier to envision than, I'm in a Death Star in Star Wars or something like that. And again, back to kind of saying earlier, we look to the past to kind of provide not just solutions for the modern era, but also a bit of our imagination, a bit of escapism, and a bit of, where we want to go.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, there was a spectacle involved in a lot of this too. That, there was the idea of going back in time, whether it was an accurate depiction of the past or the romanticized or fantasized version of that. I loved all the Sinbad movies growing up too. I mean, obviously Ray Harryhausen. I mean, of course, that's just magical movie making in and of itself. But again, there was just something about like the era, the time period. It was like, just speaking personally from growing up on the East Coast in the United States, it was an other world that was still part of Earth, and that was, had taken place at some point in time, theoretically, that you could imagine, like, oh, I wonder what this is like. Oh, I'm seeing it on screen, like they're presenting it to me, whether it was matte paintings, whether it was Ray Harryhausen-esque special effects. There was that spectacle to it that, would just captured imaginations.
You bring up Ray Harryhausen, which, his stop motion stuff was so integral to like Jason Argon stuff. I have to recommend the Neo Peplum short film. Have y'all ever heard of it's a short film about 15 minutes long. It's called Rebooted. Go on YouTube. It is there. It is one of the most amazing Neo Peplum short films I can think of. It's seriously a love letter to Ray Harryhausen, to Peplum, but also kind of a critique to, our past, our kind of rose-colored glasses. It's about a stop motion skeleton. It was a stop motion skeleton carved back in the 60s to be in this Peplum film. Now, fast forward to modern day, this stop motion skeleton is going to auditions for films and competing with like CGI monsters and stuff. And of course, he doesn't hold up. He's a stop motion skeleton. How in the world can he hold up to a CGI monster? And then one day he's walking by after a failed audition. He goes by a movie studio and the backlot or whatever, he goes in and he sees a script, and it's of a movie he was in that's being remade. And this a person with the jumping in that has the little I don't know what they're called, the little track balls that they'll do the CGI over, Gollum. There's no real Gollum, but there's an actor with all the little balls on him, the CGI. So there was that. What's that?
Motion capture.
Yeah, mocap, that's right. I should know that because there's a freaking chapter in my book on it. But here's this stop motion skeleton watching a mocap version of himself, fighting someone in this remake. And of course, it just sets him off and he wants revenge and he's going to burn the studio down. I highly recommend it, but it is a nice kind of commentary on, here's a new film. This film came out, I think 3-4 years ago. It looks so good as a short 15-minute film. I think it played on a couple circuits, but it taps into that both reverency of old Peplum, of old Ray Harryhausen stop motion, and a couple other things like monster suits and cartoon monsters, because he partners up with other folks for his grand scheme. So it's both an homage, a critique, and a love letter to these fantasy genres, but done, and that to me, that's kind of the importance of Neo Peplum, done with modern day technology, done with modern making storytelling, because we're able to tell stories now that we couldn't even dream of back then. Hence the dialogue we talked about earlier. Gladiator, to me, Gladiator is a 1960s plot, but realized today with the nudity, the blood, the spectacle, that you couldn't get back then.
So Nick, I was gonna say, yes,
watch Rebooted. Look it up on YouTube. It is fantastic.
I've got it queued.
I was gonna say that sounds amazing and right up our alley. So we will be watching that, absolutely.
Checked.
So Nick is kind of like by way of wrapping up and to have you have the last word here. So you kind of explained the origins of Peplum, right? And kind of like the roots of it, its origins, really Pete, like, how we came to know it, not knowing what it was, through movies like Conan and Beastmaster. And certainly for me, like even movies like Fire and Ice that are definitely more sword and sorcery. But when I think of something even more modern, like Primal, it's a Genndy Tartakovsky animated series on Adult Swim that is close to Quest for Fire, which was a movie that I remember in the 80s. And, it has a lot of the trappings of, Genndy Tartakovsky, who did Samurai Jack. And then he did like Clone Wars for Star Wars, the one that's animated. But it has a lot of those same ideas with the Vikings and barbarians and mythical type creatures that, have like a nod to Harryhausen in the same ways that, like, one of my favorites, the Lou Ferrigno Hercules, had like those steampunk type robots that, were not Ray Harryhausen, but were a love letter to Ray Harryhausen. And like you were saying earlier, Nick, they were made with, you could tell, love, respect for what Ray Harryhausen did in Jason and the Argonauts and the Sinbad movies. So I'm wondering, Nick, so knowing where it started, knowing how it impacted us, and then obviously with the book Neo Peplum. So what's like the future? What do you think is the next step of Peplum?
Yeah, that's something I legitimately think about every now and then, because I just don't see that much Peplum on cinema. I always say it's piggybacking on another genre. I think it's going to flourish in other mediums. There will still be sword and sorcery, sword and sandal comic books coming out, be it, Bronze Age type stuff, or, there was a comic book that came out, I have it on my shelf right there, Berserker Unbound, which is basically Beastmaster through the portal of time, but comic book form, that came out 3 years ago.
I think that's Dan Panosian who does the art on that, or he might do the cover.
Frank Martin, Mike Diodato, there it is.
Okay.
But I think the genre thrives in other medium. We had Assassin's Creed, the Vikings one. I think it was called Ragnarok. I didn't play that one. I played Odyssey. I loved Odyssey so much.
Yeah, I loved Odyssey too.
If I may, the main Cassandra to me is like the successor of Xena when it comes to female-fronted Peplum. Comics, video games, cartoons. It just seems so much easier to realize Peplum in this medium. And partly because even though the 60s, they were able to make those films on a budget, it's still a budget. There's a reason why you didn't have television Pepla until decades later. You couldn't do a movie like, a series like Rome or Spartacus, or even Hercules and Xena, which, as low budget as they were, still required a budget and effects and all that other stuff that it would be more conducive to a movie form instead of a TV format. So when I think about the future of Peplum, I still think it's going to piggyback cinematically on other genres, especially comic book films, but really thrive in other media. And to me, I'm a transmedia person. To me, it all counts. When folks say sword and sandal, there's that distinct, I'm only referring to 1960s low budget Italian cinema. I take a genre approach to it, transmedia approach that it can thrive on other genres. But I do think in a couple more years, there will be another Gladiator-esque type film that will come out of the blue and go, oh, yes, this is like Gladiator. This is like some of those old films. And the cycle will begin anew. And that's the thing. They're all cyclical. Even the 1960s Italian Peplum, it went dormant for a while. Then it came back in the 80s. Then it went dormant for a while. Then Gladiator came back. It went dormant for a while. It'll rebound, I think. Until then, though, it will be enjoyed on other platforms. Again, we talked about Hades earlier, mentioned that. There was a comic book called Oh snap! I forget what it's called. It's a romance done with Grecian gods that got an Eisner Award, I believe. All of a sudden, I can't remember what it's called. All of a sudden,
Is it Lore Olympus?
Yes, Lore Olympus. Thank you so very much. And that's the thing is those films they are to the genre as a whole is a palette. You can do so much with it. You could put Hercules into space as you. Well, there is a Hercules in space, a comic book. I kind of take the approach that none of it counts, but it all counts. There's some purists out there like, here's the myth of Hercules. This is what it means. No, Hercules, his mythology is actually based on other people's accomplishments and legends incorporated into himself and then recycled through the ages. So why not everything? I mean, it's all storytelling. It all feeds into the myth. So, like, to me, a space Hercules is just as valid as an antiquity Hercules. And because of that, you can have a crazy, sci-fi first-person shooter antiquity game or something. I don't know if one exists out there. I think Darkest of Days comes close or something. But it's such a Play-Doh Lego type genre that, and malleable. That's the other thing. Like you talked about Lore Olympus, you brought that up. Thank you so very much. I can't believe I spaced on the name of it. That I think that's ultimately the future of Peplum. It will come back in cinematic form. There will be another blockbuster film. But until then, I think it's just biding its time, but finding great success both artistically, commercially, and probably acceptance in other media. And to me, that's kind of the important aspect of what I term neo-Peplum, is that it incorporates that into it. The technological aspect, the storytelling aspect, the community aspect, stuff that just didn't exist in the 80s and before.
Well, until Space Hercules, is directed by J.J. Abrams, comes out, is released obviously by a Full Moon Video in a co-production with Alpha Video. And Nick, I'm sure you would write about that on your blog, which is on your website, nickdiak.com, nickdiak.com. Essays, your blog, link to your social media, to your bibliography, the podcast you've done, obviously the tiki and the cocktails. I think, goes without saying, thank you for a very passionate, spirited, insightful discussion. It's obvious that you love this. Thank you for providing a really good perspective on Peplum, but I think just in general on something that maybe folks didn't know what to call it, and maybe now that's kind of helped to contextualize some of this, because I think we all kind of knew this in a way. And if as all genre lovers, regardless of the genre that you love, like there's a Venn diagram where maybe Peplum was always already there in the foreground.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I greatly appreciate it. It's been very fun talking to y'all.
Yeah, this has been a blast, Nick. We really appreciate having you on. And I think for anyone out there that is looking to get into this as a genre, or maybe has been in it before and wants to pick it back up again, I mean, I think as we've discussed and as you've laid out, there are many, many touch points over the decades to jump in, and it's a very inclusive and diverse genre and subgenre. So take your pick. If any listeners out there, you can jump in wherever, and maybe like Nick, you will find yourself completely immersed and needing to know everything about everything. And we hope that you do. We hope that this has sparked a little something in you as it has clearly done in Nick.
Fan2Fan Podcast, gateway drug for Peplum. That's fine. That'll work. Awesome. Thank you, Nick. That was amazing. Thank you.
And pause. Oh my God. I feel like I didn't even talk about Peplum film, but just kind of film philosophy in general. I'm sorry.
That's the best conversation.
We just kind of, wherever it goes, we're happy to just go along with it.
I thought I would be talking about, here's the nuances of Conan and Deathstalker and Hercules and Colossus of Rhodes. I mean, I've listened to a lot of y'all's podcasts before. When Bernie reached out to me, I figured, I would listen in and see what y'all about, talking about, sequels. And one of y'all had this story about the Darth Vader helmet being proposed.
Doug, yeah.
So I expected, oh man, I'm going to get kind of quizzed on. So Yeah, sorry if I took it into more kind of general, I have a soft spot for genre exploitation films because, before I didn't have that. Now, I mean, later I do, but again, it's the ultimate art form, regardless of if it's a trauma film or an Italian Z grade, Hercules versus the Moonmen type film. There's something to appreciate about them all, and I just like talking about them.
Well, I mean, if you'd be interested, we'd love to maybe have you come back. We can get a little more, targeted on some of these and talk about some of those nuances.
Peplum Part 2. This time it's personal.
I would be down with that because, again, each movie just opens up. We brought up Your a couple times. I mean, Your is a 2-hour dialogue right there of crazy special effects, terrible acting, yet there's this charm to it. That's the thing. A lot of these films, they have an infectious charm to it that you just get sucked into it.
I said the first time that the Triceratops comes on screen in Your, I'm like, you can almost hear the wheels on the track that they're pushing it on, creaking. But I'm just like this is bonkers. I'm like, but I absolutely love it.
But, as paper mache as that Triceratops looks, take off your glasses, blur your eyes just a little bit, because again, back then you probably saw this film on a half destroyed, very rewound VHS tape. Right, yeah. That Triceratops doesn't look that bad compared to a Jurassic Park non-CGI, a raptor that was done by, more puppetry type work. It's, almost not avant-garde, but it's just on its way there. It's not quite Harryhausen, not quite Spielberg, but it's right there.
Mm-hmm.
And you can tell that there was a lot of effort put into that. And regardless, once Red Brown does the leap and forward roll over its horns, I mean, it's all, it doesn't matter. It could be a cardboard box and you're just like, what just happened?
You're sold on it. That's the thing. I think they do a good job selling you on it. As low budget these films are, they don't have that many technical errors to it. You don't see a lot of boom mics visible, for instance. You don't see a lot of other crew, like a trauma film or a really bad film. They're legit directors. They're legit folks making films, and yeah.
I would love to get into more details on some of these Peplum films, to talk about some of those nuances. I think that there's just a ton more, great conversation to mine from that. So
I'm hearing, Pete, that you want to do a 4-part discussion on You're the Hunter from the Future.
Yes, and we'll title it "You're Welcome" as to the listeners.
Well, Pete, real quick, just to let you know, because again, I mentioned earlier, I met Red Brown, and he signed my copy of Your Hunter from the Future. He autographs his as "Yours truly," spelled YOR like that, and it's the most brilliant thing ever.
That man is an entertainer and he knows his audience. God bless him.